And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor tonight to have on Heather Skriba, who is a follower of Jesus, someone that I was introduced to by Gene Crane, a mutual friend, and then heard Heather on Preston Sprinkle's podcast titled Theology in the Raw. And so I'm just delighted to have Heather with us tonight to talk about the issue of transgenderism, gender dysphoria. I think her story is going to be really helpful to us, as I know many church leaders and other committed Christians are wrestling through how to love our neighbors well, but to also speak the truth. And so, Heather, thanks for being on the podcast. How are you this evening?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Josh. I'm looking forward to it.
So I wanted to just dive right in to your story. And again, I was able to listen to your story on Preston's podcast and just was really blessed by kind of the full story. And I think a lot of Christians, again, wrestling with the issue of gender dysphoria and transgenderism, but may not have actually sat down and had coffee with someone that has experienced gender dysphoria. And so I'd love for you to just begin at the beginning. I believe that even as a child, some of the things that you experienced may have affected your view of God and then the rest of your story. So would you start there? Just let us know your story.
Yeah, absolutely. My childhood was particularly challenging, I would say. I grew up in a Christian home, but my parents divorced when I was in about second grade. So spending 1 week at my dad's house and 1 week at my mom's house. I was also spending 1 week attending Catholic church and 1 week attending Methodist church, which differ enough that my understanding of the church and what is normal practice and even just the understanding of grace and God's love, it varied enough that I was never given a solid foundation to kind of plant my stake and claim as my own and like as my identity as someone who's loved by God. And then on top of that, my relationship with both my parents was pretty rocky. So my dad was emotionally abusive, at times physically abusive, and he had this very narrow view of what femininity is, what the role of girls and women are in families, in the church, just in society as a whole. I remember multiple conversations where he would say that women are supposed to have long hair, love to dance, love to cook, and to essentially look pretty, so wear makeup and jewelry. And I found myself much more interested in the things that my brother did. So he's 2 years older than me. And his friends we lived on 50 acres. And so his friends would have like these airsoft gun wars in our backyard. And I was way more into like wearing camouflage and playing with them and playing sports and essentially doing things that were more traditionally like boy activities. And so when I saw this significant misalignment with the things that I loved, essentially how I saw myself, and I saw it collide with what my dad's view of women and femininity was. Then on the other hand, my mom was one in a stressful marriage, married to my dad, who was pretty emotionally volatile. And that led to her being emotionally absent. And they both had things in their closets that they need to work through. But that deeply affected me as a kid. And so I never saw my mom, at least in my opinion, I never saw my mom really embrace what it meant to be a woman of God. At least that modeled it in a way that I was like, this is something I want to emulate. This is something that I'm look forward to being. And then on the other hand, seeing how my version of femininity was frustrating for my dad to be around, how it never lived up to this standard and it never met the mark. It was always short of whatever was good enough. And it caused a lot of conflict in our relationship too. Like I remember when we would get into disagreements, especially about having my ears pierced, which I still don't have them pierced. He would get like sad and frustrated, and he would say that he always wished that he had a daddy's girl as a daughter. And the message that spoke to my heart was that I wasn't the daughter that he wanted. My femininity somehow brought other people pain, and that my version of like beauty and womanhood or girlhood was difficult to be around. And just so the whole experience was just so steeped in shame that I very quickly internalized it as my identity and developed a lot of self-hatred and insecurity and anxiety. And it just exponentially spiraled as I got older and as my understanding of the world just progressed, and my understanding of family dynamics and even of God. All of those things just kind of snowballed together, and things got worse as I got older. So fast forward to, were you going to say something?
Yeah, could I jump in for just a second and
Yeah.
maybe just have a thought or comment, because this is just such a rich story and a complex story. I think like all of our stories are, but it does bring up. It seems to me you can't really have a robust discussion about transgenderism without talking about gender roles in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And if people, transgenderism is complex and something that some people find controversial. Well, why don't we just throw in gender roles as well? But it does seem that at times the church pushes a more cultural view of what it means to be a boy or a girl than it is just biblical. And so I do think it's a healthy reminder to us. So can there be a creative boy? Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And again, looking more to scripture and to Christ for those roles rather than just looking at what our culture does. And probably something that the church, it's just kind of in the air in most evangelical churches, and not something that we've kind of stopped and reconsidered. So it is helpful I think for you to start at that part of your story as something that really influenced you. And so something we should consider in our churches. So just what came to mind as you were discussing that. So what you were talking about your childhood, and then you were going to jump into the next part.
Yeah. Well, bouncing off of that too, it really makes me, when I think about just our gender binary and the things that we've established as norms, if we didn't have such rigid gender roles, both in the church and outside of the church, would there even be a need for transgender identities to exist? Or with that, if we had a more fluid, or more, not even fluid, but just wider understanding and wider acceptance of differing versions of masculinity and femininity, would that alleviate some of the internal distress that is now known as gender dysphoria?
That's a really interesting thought. and
Yeah.
and true. I was also laughing about you fighting, airsoft gun wars. I had a few friends that would shoot BB guns at each other. And so I'm sure it was like, do not mess with Heather. She will shoot you. So that's fun. Well, thanks for mentioning that. And that's certainly something to mull over. I had not thought of that before. So thanks for that. So kind of next step in your story.
Yeah. So fast forwarding to college, moving along in the story. So my understanding of God also my heart got really hard towards him as I got older too. So I felt very frustrated and just shut off towards him. And the obstacles in my heart were really surrounding, like, essentially, like, God, why did you let me have this childhood? If you love me, wouldn't you have set me up for more success in life? So parents who were more equipped to love me well and bestow an identity upon me, a less confusing church experience, and essentially I was just really mad at him and projecting like the feelings that I had for my parents onto God too. So when I went to college, I went to the University of Michigan, and my first day there, I had no intention of pursuing anything God related. I was ready to really jump into the new culture and even just the new worldviews that I was able to experience and be exposed to at such a big school. I was planning on taking a women's studies class fall of my freshman year, which, again, women's studies, it has some really good perspectives to consider, but my heart posture on it was, this is the opposite of everything that I knew growing up. And so essentially I'm saying screw it to everything that was part of my childhood. I'm doing what I can do for myself now because I finally have autonomy, and my everything that I had associated the church with was negative. But on the first day of classes, someone from a campus ministry reached out to me. They were stopping by. No, they were handing out discount cards outside of the dorms and having you fill out a survey in exchange for a discount card. So of course, I was a poor college student at that time, officially, and so I filled out the survey, and the questions were something along the lines of, do you want a personal relationship with God? Are you interested in attending a community group? And do you have any interest in learning about the Bible? Or something like that. And I think I remained relatively non-committal to all of those questions, but I was open enough to it that someone called me that night and invited me to a community group, and I made up some excuse. But every week, without fail, this person would call me and invite me to be part of what they were doing on campus. And finally, it was about 6 weeks into fall of my freshman year at U of M that I finally was like, I don't have any more excuses. I guess I'll go and see what this is about. And if it's terrible, we'll go from there. So I attended this all-campus gathering, which was where all of the life groups or community groups on campus would gather for some worship, community, and a message from one of the people on staff. And the message that we heard was called the music of the gospel. So essentially, the premise of it was that if you're dancing, but you don't hear music, it's exhausting, and it's really not life-giving. It's draining, and you kind of feel awkward doing it, and you're like, what? Like, what's the point? But if you hear the music too, it puts rhythm to your movement. It brings joy. It's life-giving, and it's something that you want to invite other people into. And this is the first time that I had heard someone talk about God in a way that was relational rather than duty-based. And I realized for the first time that there was actually an aspect of, like, a characteristic of God that I wanted to be engaged with. And I saw people walking out faith and following Jesus that in a way that was interesting and enticing, and made me want more of him and want to get to know him more. So I started attending community group and attending the all-campus gatherings more and more often, and meeting with the person who invited me regularly just to answer all of the questions that I had. Part of them were heart level questions, so talking about, like, why was my childhood the way it was? And then others were more apologetic questions, so like, why do good things happen to bad people? How did God create the earth? Are dinosaurs real? How do we use science? How do science and faith coexist? And I found myself in those conversations getting really stuck on anything that had to do with LGBT issues, sexuality, and gender in the Bible. In my home, or like in my childhood, my upbringing, it was always communicated that being gay is bad and you're going to go to hell. But as I got to know God and got to experience his love and grace, I was really stuck on the idea that if a loving God says that two people loving each other is bad, then that is a very arbitrary decision, because he could just change his mind. And I really don't understand what the issue is. Love, like the whole love is love is love is love idea, was really a roadblock for me. And I had a hard time. I mean, I still honestly have a hard time not viewing it as arbitrary, because it just seems like God made the rules. Why can't he change them? And as I processed this with some people in my Christian community, I found that most people were really uncomfortable going to those deeper places with it. It was okay to have those conversations on a head level and talk about it theologically, or even in terms of what other people do. But when it became a personal matter, so I think I have personal stake in this game. I think I experience attraction towards women, because at the same time, I was in a women's studies class, getting language for these feelings that I had never really noticed or had words for. So as I'm getting this language, I'm starting to talk about what I'm feeling and my internal experience with people who are very uncomfortable with having those discussions. So it taught me essentially that the church, like the church, the Big C church or other Christians, are not a safe place to have these discussions. It's not a safe place to talk about like sexuality or anything that deviates outside of, I want to marry a man and have children. Anything outside of that norm, we really didn't have a script for. And that was a challenge to feel known and seen by my community, or even like I had a space there. So as a result of that, U of M and universities are a large place, and you can essentially find people who are much more open to to those ideas and more willing to discuss them. And so I ended up having a lot of those conversations with non-Christian friendships that I had developed while I was at school. And the difference in how they responded to those things was night and day. So my non-Christian friends essentially were willing to champion me and do whatever it takes to make me recognize or help me recognize that my identity is good. And if I'm feeling these things, then those feelings aren't bad. Like I can embrace them. It's the 21st century. I have every right to choose who I love, how I identify, and what I do with the internal experiences that I have.
So I had a couple follow-ups. One, I was a student pastor for a long time, and I sometimes felt bad about how many times I invited kids to come to youth group just using pizza. And so I don't feel so bad about that now, given the fact that it was a discount card that got your attention. So
I don't think I ever even used the discount card either.
Okay. So again, I'm just feeling a little bit better about it. They felt like a little bit gimmicky at times, but it did get a couple kids' attention. So I'm not feeling as bad.
Yeah.
And then a follow-up question, and I'm not sure if you describe it this way, but when did you have a conversion experience? Was it at this college-wide meeting or during that conversation when you were having some of the apologetics questions answered, or was it later on?
It was the specific moment was later on, but that's what really started prepping my heart to even want to follow Jesus. So then a few weeks later at a fall retreat, so it was a weekend getaway, really digging more deeply into all of the things that had been discussed at the all campus gatherings, that I had the actual conversion experience, or I made the decision to follow Jesus. But it was all leading up to that. But that's when I feel like God got my yes on that fall retreat.
Okay, but then it was after your conversion, you got God got your yes, that you then were in studies and came out. So did I get the timeline correct? Okay.
Yes. Right. So I already was walking with Jesus when the internal processing and all of that stuff came up with sexuality and gender.
All right, please continue. I was just trying to make sure I had kind of the timeline and was understanding the journey there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at the same time as I was processing all of these things and learning how to follow Jesus, I also was having a really hard time adjusting to school and to being out, just in a new environment, to finding community, and even just, I think, some of the internal the internal tension and distress that I was experiencing just in trying to figure out these core aspects of my identity actually led me to suffer from a lot of anxiety and depression. And the depression got so bad that I was having trouble showing up to work. Like, I would call in and try and get other people to cover my shifts all the time. And I just had a hard time showing up for my life. Like, I felt like I was always on, the people in my community only ever saw the tip of the iceberg of my heart. but there was so much beneath the surface that I never feel like I could communicate or get out, just because there was that wall of anxiety, and then just the heaviness of depression keeping me kind of locked up in my own head and keeping my heart just so disconnected from people who perhaps wanted to, or I know they wanted to get to know me, wanted to love me well, but those relational paths were just blocked by both of those things. And so I ended up, over the course of a couple of years in school, I sought out some counseling. And so I started meeting with a Christian counselor. And then I also started seeing a psychiatrist to get on some medication for anxiety and depression. And the Christian counseling was okay. Like, it helped me have some coping mechanisms, but I never really understood how, I don't think it really ever helped with feeling freedom from the shame that I was experiencing about my sexuality and about my gender. But at least the medication was enough to kind of bump me a little bit higher on, like, bump my depression, like, so it wasn't quite as severe as it had been. But eventually it got to the point where I had identified that I was attracted to women, and the distress that I was feeling was like, I was Googling, can I be gay and Christian? Can I be trans and Christian? Arguments for it and arguments against it. And just the perseveration and the constant fixation on both of those things was so much that I realized that I can find an argument to back up anything that I want. There's arguments theologically for any of those. Like, there are theological arguments for any perspective that you want to find. Like, you can find really anything on the internet. And so I realized that I essentially just need to either go for it or stop thinking about it. But the back and forth was kind of making my anxiety and my depression worse. So I started praying, like, God, like, if you want me to, like, if you're not okay with this, then you need to close every single door and you need to, like, shut this down. But the desire to, and the perseveration to come out never really went away. And it got to the point where I finally decided that I was just going to come out as gay and start. I had feelings for a woman at the time, and I wanted to start a relationship with her. And so I finally said, okay, God, like, I'm just going to do it, and we're going to see what happens. And so I came out as gay. It was the summer after my junior year of college. So this wrestling lasted about 2-3-ish years. And the relief that I felt with coming out as gay, it was pretty immediate. But as I started telling my Christian friends, like, their primary response was that they didn't know how to love me anymore. And what that told me was that they never really knew how to love me in the first place, because now that things are getting hard and we actually have some conflict that doesn't have a quick or easy or even any solution based on what it seemed like in those moments. Now that we have that conflict and they're running away and they don't know how to love me. And so to me, it was like, well, did you even know how to love me in the first place? And so I really, like, basically shifted and turned to the LGBT community. And as I came out, the reaction that I got was the exact opposite. They championed me. They were so excited for me. They were just so supportive of the fact that I was taking steps to essentially, like, be myself, because this is part of who I am. This is an identity thing. But as I came out as gay, there was still that inner distress that it didn't quite address. It was like I tried on a hat that felt better than the one that I had been wearing, but it wasn't quite a perfect fit. And so a couple months into coming out as gay, I started there's actually something I feel like I should probably input a little bit earlier on. And I'm also gonna plug in my computer while I just got a notification. But because at this time, So at this time, in college too, I was in a 12-step program for addiction. And step 4, you work through your harms and resentments. And so I was working through all of these harms and resentments in my heart. And I realized as I was coming out as gay that I actually had a lot of resentments towards God about making me a woman. And I was opening up to people in the LGBT community about that because essentially they were my safe place now. And their response was, well, again, this is the 21st century. If you feel like you were not supposed to be born a woman, again, you can choose, and you can you're not stuck with this identity forever. Like, you have an element of autonomy and choice with this decision.
So because I know we're going to jump into more the gender identity / transgenderism issue here in a minute, I would be interested kind of at this point. You mentioned that your Christian friends, the thing not to say is, I don't know how to love you right now.
Don't say that.
So what would your advice be to someone that is in a relationship, so a Christian friend and or a Christian parent with their child, that has that child in a sense come out and say, I'm gay? A kind of dialogue that I have thought through is, one, know that we love you unconditionally. I mean, that nothing you say, nothing that we're going to discuss today is going to change that. Two, can you explain that to me? What are you feeling? How do you define that? What does that mean to you? And so you begin with more of an inquiry, because I think this is going to be different for each person. So would you tweak that? Am I falling off the bandwagon there?
No.
Yeah.
I think you're spot on. Typically when I'm asked like a question like this, my first recommendation is to ask those follow-up questions that help you understand the situation better. So what does that mean to you? Because someone coming out as gay, they could just be letting you know that I have this experience of being attracted to people of my own gender, but I don't want to act on it. Whereas for another person, that could mean that they want to start dating and they want to start pursuing relationships. So gauging what that means for that individual is really helpful. And also just thanking them for trusting you enough to come out to you. Because it's such a vulnerable experience that even just acknowledging like that, I see you and I see that was really hard. Thank you for trusting me with that. Like, that's not something that you had to tell me. It helps to, like, I've always felt that when people have done that with me, it's eased my guard a little bit, because the vulnerability that I'm giving you my heart, and you're acknowledging that you see how vulnerable this is. And so it's like, oh, they recognize that I just did something that was really hard, and they are going to try to steward my heart well.
And of course, it doesn't mean that you're changing your position on what Scripture says. And I had this conversation it was just a great conversation with a group of Christian school teachers. And I think the temptation in that setting is going to be, you said what?
Mm-hmm.
This violates our student code. What do I, and I'm pretty sure that if you have that reaction, then the student's going to go have this conversation with the LGBTQ community and shut you down. Whereas if you're willing to have that dialogue, and I think perhaps those teachers might be in a position where the student might be even reluctant to share with mom and dad, but might be willing to share with the teacher. And that first conversation could literally have ramifications for the rest of their life. So it's just a really interesting conversation about how do we do that well. And so I wanted to ask you about that specific issue.
Yeah. And two other things that come to mind. One, don't lead with theology. They're not asking you for, typically, unless they specifically say, what are your thoughts on this? They're probably not going to need to hear what your stance is, especially if you're in the context of a Christian school. It's assumed likely that you have a traditional sexual ethic or traditional Christian sexual ethic. But then also another good follow-up question is even just, what do you need from me? Do you need me to be a person that just you listen to and talk to? Do you want me to help you research this more? Do you need me to help you facilitate that conversation with your parents? Just what you trusted me enough to come out. Like, do you need me to have a next step in this? And if so, how can I help you take that next step, or how can I be part of the next step?
That's really helpful. Because again, I mean, if you're in the context of Christian school or even a church youth group setting, I'm pretty sure that students probably sophisticated enough to know what you believe already.
Yes.
And they're willing to share that even despite what they know about it. And that conversation may happen later on. But again, that it just seems to me, even from your own story, that those initial reactions were really big on where you went next. So we should pay special care to our response. So I appreciate that. Thank you for diving in there. So what was the kind of next development in your story?
Yes. So the next developments were essentially as God was revealing these resentments that I had towards him, and the advice and the counsel that I was getting from my LGBT friends, I decided that it was the fall of my senior year. I was going to try out, not in a light sense of the word, I just don't really know how else to describe it, but I was going to try out presenting in a more masculine way and showing up to my classes, introducing myself by a different name, using male pronouns, and essentially seeing if addressing the gender side of it helped with my mental health. And so, because I figured it's 4 months, I've been living in this internal distress for long enough that if this somehow makes it worse or changes things a little bit, I'm really not any worse off than I was. It's just learning something new to cope with. But I found that as I introduced myself by a different name, so I went by Jamie, and I started using male pronouns and even just presenting in a more masculine way. So I started wearing more men's clothing. Like typically I was more of a t-shirt and jeans person anyway, but making that an intentional choice to buy men's clothing and see men, like basically dress in a way that wasn't androgynous, but that was overtly masculine. I was like, this is what my heart was looking for. So I was like, the relief from the anxiety and the depression that I felt, this is when it became so significant that it caught my attention, and it caught the attention of the people around me. I was able to get off of my antidepressants really quickly, and the people in my life said that I was much more playful. They saw parts of my personality come out that had been so squashed by shame and insecurity. I was much more outgoing. I laughed a lot more. I was much more friendly, and just these really positive things started coming out because I wasn't so consumed by the internal like distress that I had been experiencing. I could actually engage the world around me in a really, really good way. And so I started just riding that momentum, and I started praying like, God, if this is not what you want for me, then close doors. Like if this is not something that you are approving of or blessing, or if it's not your design, then make it impossible for me to do it. And I'll know like that it's time to stop. But the opposite happened. So things were just really easy for me when I transitioned. I started socially transitioning follow my senior year, of college. And a couple months in, I started looking for a endocrinologist to look into starting to take hormones. And what should have taken me 3 to 4 months to get into for an appointment took about 6 weeks. And I really viewed that as God blessing this choice. Like it should not have been that easy to have all of those things happen, even with insurance covering testosterone and everything. It should not have been that easy, but it was. And the path to transitioning and continuing to not just socially transition, but physically transition, it was a path of very little resistance.
So I think it might be helpful for some audience members, and that may be all the way from Gen Z up to more senior citizens that are just coming to this for the very first time. So a few terms, one being gender dysphoria, which, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the idea of an unease or a dissonance in between your birth sex, being born male or female, and then a perceived gender. And separating that from even kind of the idea of transgenderism, where you're kind of taking that on as an identity. I've heard you describe your gender dysphoria. And again, I think this might be helpful for those that have not had a conversation with someone that's experienced this. But kind of a white noise in the back of your heart, the back of your mind, even from perhaps a younger age where you just kind of felt that unease. Would you dig into that a little bit? I think it'd be helpful to hear your perspective on it.
White noise is actually a description of it that I use pretty often, because it's that constant humming sound that you cannot shut off no matter how hard you try. Some things make it louder, some things make it softer, but it's always there. And it's hard to put words, it's hard to describe what it sounds like. And I think often we're looking for very concrete, like, I dislike this part of my body. And sometimes that's there, but other times it's this constant feeling of distress that's really hard to put words to. And there's varying levels of it too. So there's clinical gender dysphoria, which meets the criteria outlined in the DSM-5, which is essentially the Bible of psychiatry. But then there's also the gender dysphoria that individuals experience that might not be severe enough that it warrants that clinical diagnosis, but it's still very real and it's still very difficult and it's still very present. It just might not be quite as severe as someone who would receive that clinical diagnosis.
I also found it interesting that you described, and I found the same in my own Christian walk. It's easy sometimes on an issue where, you're pulled toward, you desire something and you just think, well, scripture's pretty clear, but maybe it's okay. And then you pray kind of on circumstance. And then when the circumstances work out, you're like, oh, well, God must mean that this is what he wants me to do. When I think it's more kind of our free will that he's allowing us to move forward. But it is interesting. Like, look at these circumstances. It seems very clear this is the way that I'm supposed to go. Did you in fact, go ahead.
Well, and bouncing off of that too, in hindsight, as I've delved into even just what those experiences were like for me, now that I'm no longer in them, I think the real prayer of my heart was like, God, don't intervene. Like, I was asking him to close doors, but on an even deeper level, I was asking him to just keep his hands off. Because I think what I really wanted was to be able to transition. And if you had asked me then, I would have said like, no, like definitely I like want God to like close doors and guide me. But as I look back, I'm like, no, I really didn't want him to intervene. And I think the true prayer that I was praying was like, God, back off, because I need to know what this is like. I need to know if this is going to fulfill and satisfy me.
Wow. And thank you for sharing that, because that's applicable for every Christian that just wants to go the way of their flesh. And it's almost a prayer of, and again, not describing motive. I think it was, you're kind of trying to dissect it later, but almost a prayer of, God, I know better. And so just stay out of my life right now, and I'll come back and see you when I'm done, type of thing. But that's, I think, such a powerful word for all of us as we try to follow Jesus. So did you in fact physically transition?
Yeah. So I started taking hormones December of my senior year of college, and the effects were, they were pretty quick. I don't know exactly. It takes a couple months for things to kick in, but I started to notice things in my body shift. So like body fat redistributed to a more like masculine distribution. So like my face got a little bit longer. And even like on my waist and on my legs, like things shifted, and my voice dropped about an octave. So I started to just present in a much more masculine way. And then, and all of those changes just continued to reinforce the fact that like this was the right choice for me, because I just felt better and better about myself. I was finally able to start looking in the mirror and enjoying the person that I saw in my reflection. Like I could look at this person, Jamie, this person that I was becoming, and for once not be plagued by the self-hatred and insecurity that had developed so strongly in my childhood. Like it was almost like I created this identity that was so separate from it that I could leave that baggage behind, because this was a fresh start and a new beginning. And then I started pursuing having top surgery as well. And because again, that was the next step. And I think so often for trans guys, like top surgery is it's the thing that's going to make the rest of your gender dysphoria go away. It's like because up until then you're often binding, which is essentially wearing like a really tight compression, like garment to help have like a more masculine appearance on your chest. And like that's uncomfortable, especially in summer. And so it's like, no, this is the thing that's going to remove an additional component that shows me that I'm not a guy. Like this is one thing that's going to like take me one step closer, even if I'm never quite like biologically male. Top surgery, it's going to get me one step closer, and it's going to be one step closer to like relief from all of this. But as top surgery got closer and closer, so I was still in therapy at this time, and I met with my psychiatrist intermittently just to check in to make sure things were okay. As surgery got closer though, I started to have this twinge of doubt in the back of my head. Like, is this right? Is this wrong? Like, this is the first thing that's really, really, really permanent. Like my voice didn't go back, but voice and pitch naturally vary by person. Whereas having surgery would be like this permanent indication that I did something to my body permanently. And so I just wrote it off as that fear and anxiety about having about significant life change. So I went through with having top surgery. It was after about 9 months on testosterone, 9 months to a year. And I remember, so I had a vest on at first week after surgery. And so when I went in for my post-op appointment, I remember I had a couple friends there who had gone with me to support me. And I remember when they took the vest off for the first time, and I saw my new chest, what should have been like one of the most exciting moments in my life was actually one that was just so disappointing. Like I remember feeling this sinking feeling in my heart and thinking this was supposed to be the thing that solved all my problems, but all I feel is shame, fear, and regret. What I was looking for was soul level restoration, but what I actually did was just surface level. Like it was just skin deep. And so there was that massive disconnect between what my expectation was and what the reality of what I experienced and felt was.
And that's, again, one of the most profound things I took away from your conversation with Preston, that you were kind of addressing this body level issue, but it was actually a soul level ache that you were trying to address. And a couple of questions here. Will you explain kind of the spiritual journey that took you on? And then I have a couple other questions about this. I think it's just a really significant moment in your life.
Yeah. So after surgery, I really spiraled. I started obsessively working out, and I developed maybe not an eating disorder, but at least disordered eating, in the hopes that I could achieve this perfect body, and then I will finally be happy with my appearance. And as I saw that not working, it was almost out of a last resort. I was like, you hit rock bottom when you stop digging. And I finally hit the point when I was ready to stop digging. And so I was like, okay, the answer that I got from essentially the non-Christian world, whether that's the LGBT community, the secular world, whatever it is that's not Jesus, that answer did not work. So clearly I've hit a new low. So clearly I like the only other option is to go back to what Jesus offered. And so it developed, it like re-softened my heart to hit that rock bottom in a different way. Cause I realized, okay, like clearly I don't know what I'm doing. Clearly I don't know what my soul and my heart needs. So like, God, I'm ready to start listening again.
And I wanted to dig into just a little bit further because it troubles me that this, exactly what you've described is the prescription for so many in our society, especially with the rise in rapid onset gender dysphoria. I think there's about a 5,000% increase in the last 10 years. And so it certainly troubles me that that's kind of what the world is prescribing. Like here's this is going to address this or fix this. And I recognize that there may be others that have a reassignment surgery, and maybe at the end of it, they feel like it's solved their problem. But how should the church respond to that issue in the sense of we want to love our neighbors well, but I don't think it's loving to not point out that particular essentially alteration of your body that did not bring the soul level healing that you were looking for. So do you think, is that something we should be more vocal about, or should we be more nuanced in how we address it?
I think it depends on the individual, because the people I was not in a place in my life at that time where I would have given any sort of time of day to someone who was telling me that I shouldn't have surgery because it's like, I'm looking for something much deeper. Like I was not in a place where I would have heard that well and actually applied it. But I think there definitely are people who are in that place. And so I think it really depends on the states of the person who's pursuing transitioning and pursuing surgery. And I really hope my story is hope for people who, like, if they know, if a loved one is getting ready to have surgery and they pursue having surgery, like they're not too far gone. Like the gospel can reach them wherever they are, and Jesus can change hearts wherever you are. So there's hope that, like, even if you do have surgery, like there's still hope for you, and there's still like Jesus can still bring you back. But if you're not ready in the moment, like that is for us to essentially like listen to God and be connected to the Father, so we know what another person needs to hear. Like I have no idea what like Josh, you need to hear from God, and so I need to be receptive to what the Holy Spirit's saying, so then I know what you need, like what I need to do to like love you well as like someone who's representing God and who wants to love people like Jesus loves them.
And your response is very helpful, and in a sense, it's don't provide kind of a society-wide response to an individual that needs an actual individual conversation, depending on where they are, and the importance of relationship with that person and understanding where they are in their walk with Jesus and what they're going through in their life. So really helpful in that sense. So I think during that time, you say you kind of came back to Christ and what he had prescribed for you. If I remember correctly, at that time, you were also connecting with the new church. So will you tell that next chapter?
Sure. So essentially what happened was I started doing the same thing that I did with gender, except with being like a man and woman. I was like Googling, what does it mean to be a man of God? What does it mean to be a woman of God? Like, how do I do this? And I started going down that research rabbit hole. But I did know that as I was trying to figure those things out, like I essentially wanted to be reconnected to Christian community. So I emailed churches in the Ann Arbor area and I said, hey, I'm a trans guy. I want to join a life group, be on the worship team, and serve in the children's ministry. Like, what do you say? And there was.
Sorry, can I just take a moment to laugh about this? Because I can just imagine most pastors get like, what?
Like send to spam or something like that. But there was this one really, really sweet church in Ann Arbor that responded, and they said, we would love to have you be part of our community. We see that God is clearly moving in your heart. That's why you reached out to us. And like, we're going to basically like, we're going to make mistakes and we have no idea what we're doing with this, but like, welcome aboard. We want to walk with you through this. And they navigated it with such grace and patience with me. There was never any like, there was never any timeline or strings attached to it saying like, you can attend for 6 months. And if after 6 months, you're still a trans guy, like we'll reevaluate. There was nothing like that. They said, like, you can serve in the children's ministry. And like, if parents have questions, we will handle those conversations with parents. Like, you have as many of the conversations as you want to have, you can have. But if there are conversations that you are done having or you don't want to have or are too much, like you have enough to focus on, we will kind of lift the rest of that burden that you feel is too much. So then there's help and there's support and there's just assistance there. And they let me be part of the worship team. And same thing, if families were uncertain about, which I wasn't leading worship, I don't sing, but I play guitar. And so like, if I was up there playing guitar and the family was uncertain about it, the worship leader or some of the pastors or one of the elders, like they would take the lead on those conversations unless there was one that I wanted to have. And that just gave me the space to just receive and learn how to follow God and experience church community as someone who, like, I was ready to go into the church, ready to play the victim, have my defenses up as high as possible. And they never gave me the opportunity, because at every turn, what I experienced was love and acceptance and the ability to be part of this community.
If you don't mind, I have a couple follow-up questions. And well, first, I just want to kind of emphasize that email back to you and how you framed that well without even knowing you, but something along the lines of, if I heard it correctly, we want to thank you for sharing your heart, kind of welcome to the family. We'd like to walk through this with you. That seems to me to be kind of a template, or at least, okay, can we meet for coffee and discuss this, rather than just a blanket no, or just, like you said, spam folder or trash. But did the church have kind of a membership process, and did they welcome you into membership? Was that a requirement for service in the different ministries?
I think there was a membership process, but it wasn't a requirement for service. Okay. So that's actually something that I never pursued at that church. And so I can't speak into that a ton.
Okay. Interesting. I was just wondering how they handled it. So basically just, hey, you can come in and serve, and then helped kind of deflect some of the things that might have been asked of you in a more traditional church setting that would have been inquisitive. Okay. Yeah. I was just interested in how they handled it.
Yeah. And they had the perspective essentially that for the families that are uncomfortable with it, we know that the nuclear families that are part of this church, they will be able to find another church home, no problem. Of course, they're sad to lose any members. That's not that wasn't their heart at all, but knowing these other people will have a safe place to land, but me as this transgender individual seeking God, I might not. They essentially did triage in the situation and said, we would hate to lose this person and have them have nowhere to go. We also would hate to lose this family, but we know that they will find another safe church home for them.
I'm just grateful for their willingness to walk with you, and just recognizing, I mean, you're trying to follow Jesus like anyone else that's wrestling with desires and trying to figure out how to follow him. And so I just wanted to dig into that a little bit more. That's really helpful. And so at some point, I think along the same time in your journey, did you have a scholarship to law school? And so I was blessed with a scholarship to law school as part of my story, and I'll let you tell the rest of it, but this part of the story blew me away. Okay. So if you don't mind sharing that.
I was basically, I was looking for things. So I had finished undergrad and I was working kind of in an entry level position. And I was like, I need to do something more. So I started applying to schools or to different programs. And I applied to a counseling program. And then I also started applying to law school because I was really looking at that time to do some sort of trans advocacy. So can I help minority populations be represented and seen and have their needs met on a bigger level? And I interviewed and went through the admissions process at a school in Detroit, and because it was close to Ann Arbor, and I actually ended up getting a full ride to this particular law school. And the day and this was around the same time that I had just had top surgery. I was starting to look up what it meant to be a man and woman of God again. My heart was getting soft, and I was open to seeking God again. The day I was supposed to accept or turn down the scholarship, I felt God say to turn it down. And I was like, what the heck? Like God, do you know what you're talking about? Like, this is a full ride to law school. Like, this will set me up for so much success now. But I was so confident that I was hearing God's voice. Because you just know sometimes. And I was so confident that I was understanding and getting used to hearing from God again and being open to it. And I was like, okay, this is my chance to show that I'm ready to hear what he has to say. And so I turned down that the scholarship to law school. And the next day I felt God ask me, why are you settling for your brokenness? And I was like, oh geez, I don't know. But he kind of pushed a little bit more and kind of poked at that a little bit more and asked essentially don't you know that what I, God, offer is wholeness? You're looking for this soul level healing, and you're looking to heal your femininity, but what your behavior and what your actions are showing me is that you don't actually want to address it. You just want to sweep it into the corner and make it disappear. So if you you're not having to deal with it, but you're also not dealing with it. So you're avoiding it and not healing, but also not feeling that pain that you were feeling. And so in this conversation with him, he then asked me if I would go to this women's conference in Colorado, because I had been looking up resources from a ministry that I particularly love, and that had been recommended to me over the course of my walk with God. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do my email thing again. And I emailed this ministry and I said, hey, I'm a trans guy. I feel like God is asking me to go to your women's conference. What do you say? And again, I was ready for them to say no and say that I was being creepy or something like that.
By the way, I love just how upfront you are in kind of a profession where everybody kind of dodges things. I just love hey, here's my question.
I mean, if you're going to reject me, let's just get it out of the way now instead of waiting 6 months. So,
yeah.
But again, they didn't give me the opportunity. They said, welcome, you can bring a friend, you can have your own room to stay in. So you don't have to share a room with 12 other women, and whatever other barriers are in your way, let us know. Clearly God is moving, clearly God is speaking. We want to remove barriers so you can come and receive from him and hear his voice.
That's beautiful. And just coming back to what God told you, that question, why are you settling for your brokenness? I mean, I think every Christian needs to hear that today. I certainly do. With whatever besetting sin or issue we struggle with, God's offering himself. And kind of early on in my spiritual journey, wrestling through this, had a law partner that was able to lead a woman to Christ. And it was never about, it's not about becoming straight. It was always about following Jesus. So he always said it's about that. And if you're following Jesus, that's what God wants. And we can have a discussion about this outside of it, but it's more about following him. And so did you, I assume, went to the conference, and was there anything particular that God showed you there?
I mean, the whole weekend was amazing. So this conversation with God happened in May of that year, and the conference was in October. So I kind of was in this spot of starting to just dig into what it meant. But I really didn't feel like God asked me to make any changes at that point in time. So I was still living as Jamie, still using male pronouns, still taking testosterone. But it was cultivating that softness in my heart. And so by the time the women's conference came around, one of my sweet friends came with me, and I mean, God spoke so much that weekend, but I feel like what summarizes that weekend more than anything else is this one talk that they gave called Your New Name. And the premise of it is that we take on identity based on our wounding. So for me, like I shared earlier with my relationship with my dad, it was like hard to love. Your femininity brings pain. Your femininity is hard to be around. Your femininity is defective. And all of those things were like in my heart as my identity that I had swept to the corner and that I was ignoring. And at the end of the talk, there was an opportunity there was a response time for us to wait on God and receive a new name, one that He bestows on us. That's essentially how He sees us. And the identity or the name that I got was Daddy's Girl. And it flipped the wound from my dad, where he would say that he always wanted a daddy's girl as a daughter. It flipped it on its head. And I just felt that like more loved by God than I had ever felt before, knowing that even with my flat chest, short hair, deeper voice, tomboyish, and like all of those things that had always been these point of like, I'm not enough. Like he still calls me his daughter as a result of those. Like I'm not earning a seat at the table of femininity by how I dress or what I do. I have a seat at the table of femininity because God calls me His daughter. And the rest of everything else falls into place as a result of that. But first and foremost, like femininity is like found in the identity of daughter of God.
Well, and I wish I could package that up because it's so beautiful. Sometimes I describe the Orthodox Christian view of gender, sex/gender, as we're created immutably male or female as an expression of His image and nature. But I think God calls you a daddy's girl. That's probably the best. That's a much more beautiful way to put it. And at that time in your life, I mean, how did you receive that? Was it just kind of the moment where you're looking to Him and not the brokenness?
What do you mean?
So, I mean, the new name being Daddy's Girl would have been kind of contrary to the identity that you were living at the moment. So is that when you decided to go back to living as Heather, or was that later on?
Yeah, no, that was the moment where I was like, okay, like I can essentially, like, I can trust this. He's not asking any more of me than like, well, not even that, like he's worth the things that He asks us to do. And so when I went back to work after that weekend, I met with my boss, and they all knew I was trans at work. But I was like, hey, I need to go back to living as Heather, and I need to switch my bathroom and my pronouns and my name starting now. And she was great, my boss at the time. Like, she had a little team meeting and said, hey, Jamie is now Heather, effective immediately. If you have any questions, don't talk about it behind her back. Go up and ask her. Basically, like, let me set that boundary. And then I just was like, and then I essentially just like thanked them for being understanding and said, I know it's going to be awkward. Like, I know you guys are so used to calling me Jamie and he that there's going to be slip ups. That's okay. But thank you for like learning and just being flexible with me, because I was expecting this much less than anybody else was. So like, thank you for supporting me in that. So I started just by switching my name and pronouns. Like, at that time, I never felt like God asked me to change what I was wearing, to really make any other modifications other than just being okay with being identified as a woman again. And then from there were just like, over the course of, let's see, it's been 3, 4, or 5 years. I don't even know. It's been a while now. And I just feel like the course correction that I've been on has been so gentle and so gradual, but yet I look back to where I was when I first started going by Heather again and to where I am today. And like so much change has happened, but it's just been these small adjustments in the direction that I'm headed, that over the course of the years, it leads to a very significant change in destination. So it started like a couple months later, it was like getting rid of a lot of my men's clothing and just going back to t-shirts and jeans, and then growing my hair out a little bit, and then changing the glasses that I was wearing. So these very, 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 very small adjustments that have led to such significant change over the course of the years. But it's at such a pace that like only God could have been able to provide me, because it's exactly what my heart has been ready for each time. He's been like, okay, it's time to change something else.
And again, back to follow Jesus, and then the rest of these things, will work out as you attempt to follow his way. And again, I think you end up in a more, biblical spot of what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman, rather than just, okay, what does even American evangelical subculture say? This is how you have to look, which I think it's important to have that conversation and be distinct from the world, but to have the Bible as the standard, and not just what our subculture has always said it is. And so now you have a ministry, in a sense, kind of speaking, telling your story to others, and certainly grateful for that. Before we end, I'll ask kind of how we could be praying for you in this kind of next season of how God's using you. And again, I appreciate your time today. I want to be conscious of your time, but a couple of kind of follow-up questions from your story. Again, as I think committed Christian parents as well as church leaders are trying to think through how to minister well to others. And the first one would just be the scenario of a Christian parent with a child that comes to them. And sometimes due to this being introduced in schools, this could be as early as maybe 7, 8 years old. How would you counsel Christian parents? Again, I understand it's going to be different with each child, but just even some general thoughts on how to respond well.
Yeah. I mean, similar to like or what we talked about earlier with the conversations around coming out, ask good questions, and just, I think the goal is to like probe their hearts, not modify their actions. So check in and see how their heart's doing, what's going on really on that soul level. But also especially for parents, like make space for yourself to grieve, not in front of your kid, but find support, because no matter what, like I think one of the hardest narratives to combat is that someone's gender and sexuality is their business and it affects no one else. But at the end, no, that's not true at all. It affects every single person in their life, especially parents, because there is that level of, my child is different than I expected them to be. And there's grief associated with that, especially thinking about like grandkids, or like I don't know, there could be a whole variety of things that are connected to that. But making sure that you have space to grieve that's not in front of your child, so you can start moving through your own emotional journey with it, because it becomes like it's like a parent story as much as it's a child's story too. And those stories are very different, but there's going to be loss to be grieved, and to acknowledge that and start working through it, I think will help maintain relationship with your child in the long run.
Yeah, just digging into this a little bit further, and if it gets to a point where like, well, this is a little too difficult to answer broadly, just let me know. Mm-hmm. But especially given a teenager, that it becomes less, okay, I want to let you know we're having a discussion, mom and dad, and more, no, you are going to affirm me, and you are going to recognize my new name and pronouns, and I'm going to wear the clothing I want. And so it goes from kind of a parental conversation, and maybe there've been some opportunities missed in the past, but it becomes more of a confrontation, and the parents kind of stuck in the position of, I don't really feel like I can go there because of what I believe. I love my kid. So any advice or thoughts if it gets to that level?
I struggle with this one, honestly, because I'm not a parent. And so I think when I think about like that hard confrontation, and even just the times that I had really hard confrontation with like my family, because my mom was pretty supportive, but like my dad and my aunt didn't call me by name for like 2 years. Like I wasn't Heather, I wasn't Jamie, I was just there. Those were the closest things to confrontation that I had, or in those relationships. And but I wasn't a teenager, I was already in my 20s, so I honestly struggle to like give specifics for this one, because I would hope that, like, to me it's like that confrontation and that combativeness is self-protection for something else. And it's like, how can we get to the heart of the matter of what's going on? Like, is it that you're scared? Like, are they scared that they're going to get rejected? Or, I mean, I felt like I constantly had to be on the offensive because everybody is like, oh, are you sure that you're making the right choice? And I'm so tired of telling people that, yes, I'm sure, that there is almost that combative stance with coming out just to get people to stop questioning it. So maybe
go ahead. And that's helpful in the sense of keep trying to get to the root of the issue. And if you keep fighting at the surface level, just smashing heads back and forth, it becomes kind of a power play that probably doesn't help. It's keep trying to love them well and get to that heart issue. Yeah.
And even just saying and showing, like, I'm not trying to change your behavior. I just need a second to get caught up because you've been thinking about this a lot longer than I have. Like, I don't know if something like that would even help, like, put like weapons down a little bit. But I think like in my experience, if someone acknowledged that they were not trying to change the outcome, it put me at ease a lot. And while parents obviously like most likely don't want to see their kids transition, if they have that traditional Christian sexual ethic, just first working on it in your own heart and being like, I'm not going to try and control this and like change this outcome, right? Like that's beyond my control. And so then letting go and like communicating that to their child, I would imagine would help with that combative stance a lot. But again, like my experience is like I really can only speak from my experience on that one.
And my experience thus far in working through this is if you do get to that point and you're just smashing heads, it becomes almost like nuclear war in a sense.
Right.
And you almost have to wait until there's some sort of breakthrough from the Lord, or softening of the heart. And so it's a really hard question. And certainly parents are still in a parental role. They're responsible for that. And, saying this is what's going to happen under my roof. This is what we believe, and you're going to act accordingly. The hope is getting to it earlier and having some of those earlier conversations, I think, is perhaps the best hope for avoiding that sort of thing. Because the moment someone turns 18, if it's that kind of loggerheads and they have their own, they have their own legal right to go transition if they want. Right. And so I appreciate your thoughts. I know that's a really hard question that a lot of us are struggling through.
Yeah. Actually, one additional thought on that really quick. I think too, like prior to reaching that point, just being aware of your dialogue in the house about LGBT individuals. Like if someone constantly hears negative comments towards LGBT individuals, the odds of me feeling safe enough to come out and have an open dialogue, or even just like a heart level dialogue about it, are going to be really slim. So just that awareness of what are my everyday comments and what are my everyday like judgments communicating about my views about this. Like, do I really view that LGBT people are people to be loved, or are my side comments communicating a lot of judgment and criticism and even disgust towards them?
That's a really important point. Treating them as fellow image bearers. We may disagree with their choices. We still see them as people to be loved and reached. I see that as important as well. One last follow-up on this particular issue. I've seen a lot of Christians land in I don't feel like I can use the pronouns in good conscience, because you're essentially stating something foundational. Okay, I'm calling a he a she. Now I am actually affirming that they are female when they're born male, but feeling more comfortable with using a chosen name because names are culturally gendered. So what is Chandler a boy's name, girl's name, or even some names that have a feminine connotation? So in the moment when you were fully identifying as trans, would you have, if you're in a relationship with someone and they explain that to you and said, I can't in good conscience because of what I believe use preferred pronouns, but I will use a chosen name, would that have been a non-starter for you?
I think it would have depended on the relationship. Like, there were some people that I was much more willing to give with those things on. Like, some people were much more willing to use they instead of he. So kind of meet in the middle of, at least it's like neutral rather than male or masculine. But it really depended on the relationship. Some people that shut it down right away, but others, I don't know, like, I feel like God gave me like this patience with people in that too, that maybe not everybody has. But
Sure.
like, if someone said, so my last name's Skriba, and a lot of people call, like, most people even now call me by that just as like a nickname. So if they were like, hey, I'm not quite on board with Jamie yet, can I just call you Skriba? I'd be like, okay, like, that's fine. Like, I see that you are in some ways taking steps to be uncomfortable to maintain relationship with me. So there were times where I was willing to kind of meet in the middle. Other times, depending on how that conversation was addressed, if it was like, I can't do this, like, you're Heather and her, I'd be like, okay, well, bye. So but again, I know that not every trans person is that way. Some people are very, not even strict, but like very, like, this is a deal breaker for them, because it is such a sensitive, and even like sometimes hearing those old pronouns and names like will like trigger like more intense levels of gender dysphoria. So it depends on the individual, and it depends on the relationship. Again, like, I was most of the time okay with some sort of compromise.
Okay, that's helpful. And then now moving over, from parents to church leaders. I know we've dug into this a little bit with the church in Ann Arbor, but any advice, thoughts that you'd have for church leaders as they're trying to minister well to those that might be experiencing gender dysphoria?
The things that were really helpful, I think, for me in the church was, and I know there's varying opinions on this, but just being able to serve and be engaged as a normal churchgoer. It's really easy to elevate one sin over another. But I found myself like feeling, if I wasn't able to serve, or even just like now when I hear about stories about LGBT individuals unable to serve in church, it's like, well, like, there's a pornography epidemic rampant in our churches. There's a lot of anxiety. The Bible says don't be anxious, but anxious people are still able to serve in church. And so, and yes, I know it's controversial and there's nuance to it as well, but I think being ready to start having those conversations of, okay, when an LGBT person, an openly LGBT person walks into our church, what do we have in place to make them feel loved and accepted. And if that's not serving, like if that is a hard line for some churches, that's okay, but be able to compensate for that hard line. So like, how else are you going to make them feel loved and like they're part of this family? And also like receiving their input on that as well. So hey, like we're not super like we don't have a ton of LGBT people in this church. What are you looking for to feel loved and accepted and part of this family? Because at the end of the day, we want them to be able to meet with God. Like Jesus is the one who changes hearts in all of us, not just LGBT people. But just starting to have those conversations now, because the odds of there being someone closeted in your church are pretty high. And the day is coming when an LGBT person will set foot in your church. And it's like, we want to be ready to be having, like Jesus sat with sinners and tax collectors. Like, are we ready to have dinner parties with people who are vastly different than us?
And something that I hear is a fairly consistent theme is that the LGBTQ community does community so well. And in comparison is the church. I mean, we are supposed to speak with clarity. And I love Sam Alberry's kind of three things, like clarity, here's what we believe, but compassion, and then community. And something that strikes me about, especially those that experience same-sex attraction, are following the way of Jesus, have committed to kind of celibacy, and are saying, I'm choosing Christ over a lifestyle that is literally being celebrated. I mean, all you'd have to do is just say, well, I'm gonna buy this other interpretation of scripture that's out there, and I'm just gonna go live out my desires. That, are we helping those individuals when they walk through the door to feel the love of Christ? Say, hey, we're on the same journey and trying to follow Jesus in a difficult and changing time. Or are we kind of saying, ooh, we don't want to talk to you. We don't understand you. So that's, something again, every church may land in a slightly different place on how to do that well. But I really think we need to be thinking through, because this is affecting Americans everywhere. And even 10 years ago, when I started going to churches, this was a conversation that very few people were having. Now, everywhere I go, there are questions about this. So I think it is something we need to be prepared for.
Absolutely.
And again, kind of one last question. As I've talked, especially to Sam and others, I know there's a bit of a debate over this. How do you use the terminology? Same-sex attracted? Are you a gay Christian? Don't want to dive in, all of that if you don't want to go there. It seems to me that the key here is you recognize the way of Jesus. You're doing your very best to follow him. You're not finding your ultimate identity in that particular desire. And then we've kind of really have to navigate that language as the church. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know that's a kind of ongoing conversation.
One thing that I think it's Tim Keller says, but essentially you learn the language of the community to which you're ministering. And so being like, we as a church often use like same-sex attracted or things like that, but recognizing that language does not exist in the LGBT community. Like, no one uses that term. And so recognizing that if we want to adequately and appropriately minister to the LGBT community, then we have to be willing to understand the language that they're using. They might be using transgender, they might use gay, they might use queer, which has kind of been, it used to be a derogatory term, and now it's been taken back as a term of, as an identity term, and even like a term of it has a positive connotation now. But being willing to learn that language and use that language where it's appropriate and where it's needed. So in the church, like using things like same-sex attraction is really like, that's common. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. But when you start using same-sex attracted to an LGBT individual, that immediately distances you from them, because they're like, oh, you're from the church. You probably just want to change my attraction. So the easiest thing to do in those situations is just ask, like, how do you identify? Oh, I identify as gay. Great. What does that mean to you? Oh, I am attracted to people of the same sex, but actually choose to not date them. And like that, I just open, or I'm attracted to people of the same sex and whatever. But like asking individuals how they identify and then asking what that means is a great entry point into understanding someone's context and story. And even just in what language to use. Like, and then if they say that they prefer to be called a certain thing, like that's an easy give for me if it maintains relational connection.
And that's really helpful. And we were supposed to become all things to all men. The church has done well. I mean, I sometimes say, the gospel has gone from kind of an empty tomb in the Middle East to our smartphone apps. It's gone all around. We're a global historic church, and trying to minister well to different communities. This is an evangelistic opportunity for us. And I do see a distinction in between on one hand, you're trying to minister to someone, and then the state kind of mandating you have to do this. I think there's a distinction there, and I would leave that up to the individual's conscience. But I hear you loud and clear on you need to understand their language. It's so if you go in there calling them same-sex attracted, you might as well be like waving the Christian flag and saying, yeah, I'm here to convert you.
Exactly.
And you may not get to a second conversation with them being the point. Well, Heather, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's going to be so helpful, and it's been helpful to me. I know it's going to be very helpful to our listeners. Anything else that you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Gosh, not off the top of my head. I feel like we covered a lot.
I think we have. You may be like, oh, no more questions. And I noticed Heather has a cat or two, and my goal was to try to keep them entertained, but they kept turning their backs and then going. So I guess I failed at entertaining the cats, but I have been intrigued the whole time.
No, they just wander in and out whenever they please. So
okay, but enjoyed the conversation. Last question. If you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the gospel preaching church, what would you put on it?
I think I would put like, our job is to connect people to Jesus. His job is to change hearts.
Amen to that. And that comes back to, again, a former law partner, longtime listeners know Brian Schutte. And kind of my first interaction as a Christian with someone from the LGBT community that came to Christ. It was not about pushing you towards liking guys. It was, are you following Jesus? And then see how God changes the heart. So very powerful. Well, Heather, thanks again for taking some time. How can we be praying for you in kind of this next season of ministry? And we'll say a quick word as we jump off.
I think that I typically feel like I just word vomit when I share my story, and just continuing to like that God would just continue to speak through like the word vomit and the things that I would just communicate clearly the things that he wants me to communicate, because I feel like this is such a tense conversation to be navigating, and just so that I would do so with grace and wisdom, because ultimately, like, I want him to be honored. So
would you mind if I say a quick word as we close? Heavenly Father, I thank you for Heather, her willingness to share her story, and just how beautiful it is that you were always there for her, that she's always been a daddy's girl, that you have loved her and you've pursued her, just as you've pursued my heart through my brokenness. And God, just a beautiful story that's so timely, so needed for us as we attempt to reach our culture. God, I pray for church leaders, for parents that are listening to this. Would you give us the wisdom, just the right words to say to our culture, to those that we're in relationship with? God, would you open doors for us, that we might be able to minister to those outside the church's walls, that don't understand the beauty of the gospel. And so but we just learned from Heather's story. Thank you for her sharing that with us. I pray that you would give her just clarity as she shares this story, wisdom as she shares this story, and effectiveness to just communicate this truth clearly to those in the church. I pray for upcoming opportunities that she has to share that. Thankful opportunity to just come around and really celebrate you, Lord, as you've worked in our hearts, and we continue to be able to serve you in our time. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.